I was stationed on the Executor when the reports first came through. Fragmentary intelligence from Malachor that mentioned her name alongside descriptions of ancient Sith temple destruction and Inquisitor casualties that Command wanted buried deep enough that even asking questions about them could end a career. I was a communications officer then, third shift monitoring officer responsible for filtering signals intelligence before it reached the bridge staff, which meant I saw things that were supposed to disappear into classification protocols before anyone with actual authority had to acknowledge their existence. The report described a female Togruta engaging multiple Inquisitors simultaneously in the temple's lower chambers, her fighting style analyzed as Jedi, derivative but evolved beyond traditional forms, her survival indicating either extreme luck or capabilities that our threat assessment models hadn't adequately predicted. The notation at the bottom, appended by someone in ISB command structure, identified her as a high-priority target designated Fiam, real name Ahsoka Tano, former Jedi Padawan to Anakin Skywalker, which meant former Padawan to Lord Vader before his transformation, which meant she represented a direct connection to our supreme military commander's previous existence that the Empire preferred to pretend had never occurred. I flagged the report for deletion as per standard protocol for information involving Lord Vader's past. But I made a copy first, because something about the way the intelligence was written suggested the analyst who'd compiled it was terrified, not of the subject but of what acknowledging her existence might mean for their own survival. That fear intrigued me more than the tactical details, more than the Inquisitor casualties or the temple destruction, because fear in ISB analysis was usually reserved for force phenomena that violated understood parameters, or for discovering evidence of systematic failures in Imperial intelligence infrastructure. I'd been trained at the Coruscant Academy before the transition, back when it was still Republic intelligence, and one thing they'd taught us that survived the ideological purging was that analyst fear was often the first indicator of genuinely important intelligence. The emotional response that emerged when trained minds encountered patterns their frameworks couldn't adequately process. So I started building a file, unauthorized and hidden in the communications system's maintenance logs, where routine audits wouldn't detect it, collecting every reference to Ahsoka Tano that passed through my station. The accumulation was slow because most mentions were redacted or deleted before reaching my level. But over 18 months, I assembled enough fragments to construct a narrative that was incomplete but suggestive. A story that explained why ISB analysts were afraid of acknowledging her existence. She'd been present at the Jedi Temple during the Clone Wars, trained by Skywalker himself during the conflict's most intense period, exposed to combat and command responsibilities before most Padawans would have been considered ready for trials. She'd left the Jedi Order before its destruction, the exact circumstances unclear, but apparently involving some kind of trial or accusation that had resulted in her voluntary departure. This meant she'd survived Order 66 not through luck or hiding, but through simple absence, already gone when the purge began. Already outside the structure that was systematically destroyed. The intelligence from the Imperial period showed her operating as a rebel intelligence coordinator, the FEL CRUM designation apparently a codename she used when providing information to nascent resistance cells that were beginning to coalesce into something approaching organized opposition. Her value wasn't tactical. Individual cells rarely possessed significant military capabilities, but rather strategic. Her intelligence allowing scattered groups to coordinate actions that created disproportionate disruption to Imperial operations. She knew how the Empire functioned because she'd watched the Republic transform into it, understood our operational protocols because many had been inherited from the Grand Army she'd served alongside, could predict our responses because she'd been trained by someone who was now one of our supreme commanders. The psychological profile attached to one report described her as uniquely dangerous not because of her force abilities, which were significant but not unprecedented, but because of her institutional knowledge combined with her outsider status. Someone who understood both Jedi and Republic military culture, but was bound by neither organization's limitations. What disturbed me most in these reports was evidence that she'd encountered Lord Vader directly. Multiple documented confrontations where she'd not only survived but apparently fought him to tactical stalemate. The details were heavily redacted, but enough remained to indicate these weren't brief skirmishes, but extended engagements where her knowledge of her former master's fighting style gave her defensive advantages that offset his superior power. One report from an Imperial pilot who'd observed a confrontation on some moon, whose name was redacted, described watching their duel through enhanced optics, noting that the Togruta female seemed to anticipate Lord Vader's attacks with uncanny precision, as though she could read his intentions before he acted on them. The analyst who'd compiled that report noted this might indicate a force bond that had survived Skywalker's transformation into Vader, a connection that persisted despite his corruption and her abandonment of the Jedi path. That possibility, that some fragment of Anakin Skywalker might still exist within Lord Vader, accessible to someone who'd known him before, was apparently so disturbing to Imperial command that the entire investigation had been classified above standard operational levels and transferred to specialized ISB divisions that handled force-related intelligence deemed too sensitive for regular personnel. I should have stopped my collection at that point. Should have recognized that continuing meant crossing into territory where discovery would result not in reprimand, but in disappearance. The kind of administrative erasure where personnel files were amended to indicate you'd never existed, and colleagues who asked about you were told you'd been transferred to classified assignments that couldn't be discussed. But I'd already gone far enough that stopping wouldn't protect me if the unauthorized file was ever discovered, and the alternative, continuing to gather intelligence about someone who apparently represented everything the Empire was designed to suppress, seemed somehow important in ways I couldn't adequately articulate even to myself. The psychological profile I assembled from scattered references painted a picture of someone who'd been shaped by trauma and loss, but hadn't been destroyed by it, who'd experienced betrayal by institutions she'd trusted, but hadn't surrendered to cynicism or nihilism. She'd been accused of crimes by the Jedi Order, the exact details unclear, but apparently involving a bombing at the temple and a complex conspiracy that had nearly resulted in her execution. The Order had expelled her to face Republic military justice, abandoned her to a system that presumed guilt, and demanded she prove innocence without the resources or authority she'd possessed as a Jedi. She'd been exonerated eventually, the real perpetrator identified and captured, but the damage was done. Her faith in the Order's wisdom and justice had been shattered, her sense of identity as a Jedi irrevocably compromised. When they'd offered to reinstate her, she'd refused, walking away from the only life she'd known, because she could no longer trust the structure that had failed her so completely. That decision made her dangerous to us in ways that standard threat assessments couldn't adequately capture. Most force-sensitive rebels were either surviving Jedi trying to preserve their Order's legacy, or dark side practitioners pursuing personal power, both categories that Imperial intelligence understood and could predict. But Ahsoka Tano was neither. Someone who'd been trained in Jedi philosophy, but had rejected its institutional framework, who possessed significant force abilities, but wasn't bound by dogma about their proper use, who understood both Republic and Imperial military doctrine, but owed loyalty to neither. The tactical analyses I found described her as improvising constantly, her operational patterns inconsistent enough to defeat predictive models. Her strategic objectives unclear beyond general opposition to imperial authority. She helped rebels but didn't seem to be building a movement or accumulating power for herself. Provided intelligence and resources, but maintained operational independence that prevented us from tracking her through her collaborators. I started having dreams about her after processing particularly detailed reports. Not nightmares exactly, but scenarios that felt prophetic. Premonitions of confrontations that hadn't happened yet. I'd see her standing in the executor's corridors, her white lightsabers ignited, and her mantrals decorated with patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. She'd speak in these dreams, but I could never remember her words upon waking, only the sense that she'd been trying to explain something important about the nature of power and loyalty, and the difference between service and servitude. The ship's medical officer diagnosed stress, induced hallucinations, and prescribed medication that made the dreams less vivid, but didn't stop them entirely, their content adapting to whatever suppressants I took as though they existed independently of my neurochemistry and were merely using my consciousness as a projection surface. The breakthrough in my understanding came from an unexpected source, a fragment of recovered rebel communications that mentioned Tano's presence on Malachor, the same ancient Sith world where the early reports had placed her. This intelligence was fresher, less than 3 months old, and included tactical analysis of a confrontation between her and Lord Vader that ISB command had tried to bury so thoroughly that merely accessing the file triggered monitoring protocols. I only noticed because I'd been trained to watch for them. I read it anyway, knowing discovery was now probable, and deciding that understanding was worth the risk of administrative erasure. The report described a duel in the Sith Temple's depths, Vader pursuing her through chambers decorated with ancient glyphs that pulsed with residual dark side energy. They'd fought across multiple levels, her twin sabers meeting his crimson blade in patterns that suggested intimacy rather than opposition, as though they were continuing a conversation that had been interrupted years earlier, rather than fighting to kill. The analyst who'd observed through probe droid footage noted something disturbing. Lord Vader's fighting style had changed during the engagement, becoming less mechanically efficient and more emotionally expressive, as though Tano's presence was somehow drawing out the Anakin Skywalker personality that was supposed to be dead. She'd spoken to him during the fight, her words recorded by the probe droid's audio sensors, saying things like, "I won't leave you, not this time," and "I'm not afraid of you," in a tone that suggested she was addressing her former master, rather than the Sith Lord he'd become. The report noted that Vader had responded verbally, which was extremely unusual. He typically killed efficiently and silently, viewing conversation during combat as tactical weakness. His responses were heavily distorted by his vocabulator, but the emotional content was unmistakable, something between rage and anguish, as though her presence was causing psychological distress that interfered with his normal operational parameters. The confrontation had ended inconclusively, the temple's structural instability forcing both combatants to retreat before either could achieve definitive victory. But the psychological impact on Lord Vader was apparently significant enough that he departed Malachor immediately afterward, rather than completing his original mission objectives. The ISB analyst who'd compiled the report recommended immediate termination of Ahsoka Tano as maximum priority target, noting that her capacity to destabilize Lord Vader's psychological conditioning represented a strategic threat to Imperial command structure that exceeded any tactical advantage her death might provide to rebel operations. The recommendation had been flagged and transferred upward through classification levels that suggested it had eventually reached the Emperor's attention, but no operational orders had been issued, as though someone at the highest level had decided that leaving her alive served some purpose that exceeded the risks her existence posed. I began experiencing temporal distortions after reading that report, moments where the ship's chronometers didn't match my subjective experience of elapsed time, conversations with colleagues that I remembered having but they insisted hadn't occurred, finding myself in sections of the executor I didn't remember walking to. Medical scans showed no neurological abnormalities, but the ship's force, sensitive inquisitor who was brought in for consultation suggested I might be experiencing force echoes, residual psychic impressions left by powerful force users that could sometimes affect sensitive individuals, even without direct contact. She asked whether I'd been handling materials related to specific individuals, whether I'd been experiencing dreams or visions, whether I felt presences that others couldn't perceive. I lied, claiming only routine intelligence work and normal stress symptoms, because admitting the truth would mean revealing my unauthorized investigation and everything I'd learned that was supposed to remain buried. But the Inquisitor wasn't fooled. Her presence in the Force, apparently allowing her to perceive deception, even when the deceiver believed themselves convincing. She looked at me with an expression that combined contempt and something almost like pity, then told me that obsession with particular Force users could create a kind of connection through the Force itself, that focusing mental energy on someone powerful enough could establish a sympathetic resonance that allowed their presence to intrude into your consciousness. She said this as though explaining something obvious, as though everyone knew that thinking too intensely about Force sensitives could make you vulnerable to their influence. And then she departed without filing any formal report about our conversation. I realized later this was a warning disguised as consultation, the Inquisitor recognizing what I was doing and choosing to alert me to the danger rather than reporting it through official channels. Perhaps because she recognized something in my investigation that resonated with her own doubts about Imperial service. The dreams intensified after that conversation, becoming less like dreams and more like visitations, as though Ahsoka Tano was somehow aware of my investigation and reaching through the Force to communicate directly. She'd appear in my quarters, sitting in the chair opposite my bunk, her appearance shifting between her younger self as I'd seen in archived Clone Wars footage and her current form as described in recent intelligence reports. She'd speak about the war and what it had revealed about the Republic's corruption, about how the institutions that claimed to serve peace had been preparing for conflict all along, about how she'd learned to distinguish between legitimate authority and the mere appearance of legitimacy. I'd wake from these dreams with her words, echoing in my consciousness, unable to dismiss them as mere psychological projection because they contained information I didn't consciously possess, details about Clone Wars battles and Jedi operations that I had to verify later through classified archives, all of it accurate. All of it suggesting these weren't dreams but actual Force communication. I should have reported these experiences immediately, should have submitted to ISB psychological evaluation and accepted whatever reconditioning or reassignment they determined necessary. But I'd become convinced that understanding Ahsoka Tano's progression from Jedi Padawan to whatever she'd become was somehow crucial to understanding the Empire's fundamental vulnerabilities. She represented a path that the Empire claimed was impossible, someone who'd been trained in institutions that should have defined her identity completely, but who'd managed to transcend those institutions without collapsing into nihilism or merely transferring her loyalty to different structures. She'd been betrayed by the Jedi Order and had chosen not to seek revenge, but simply to walk away, had survived Order 66 through absence rather than combat, had watched the Republic transform into the Empire, and had chosen resistance without claiming to represent some alternative legitimate authority. The pattern was significant because it contradicted fundamental assumptions built into imperial ideology. We were taught that beings required structure and authority, that the alternative to imperial order was chaos and violence, that those who opposed the empire were either deluded idealists who didn't understand political reality or dark-side practitioners seeking power for themselves. But Tano didn't fit either category. She opposed the empire effectively without claiming moral authority or seeking to establish alternative power structures, helped rebels without trying to lead or control them, survived through adaptation rather than rigid adherence to principle or philosophy. She'd learned something that both Jedi and Sith apparently hadn't understood, something about power and identity and the relationship between individual consciousness and collective structures. I found a fragment of her voice in a captured rebel transmission, brief audio that hadn't been fully scrubbed from the intelligence before it reached my station. She was speaking to some rebel operative about the nature of the fight against the Empire, explaining that victory wouldn't come through military defeat, but through something else, something about people remembering they had the capacity to choose. That authority existed only insofar as beings granted it legitimacy through their compliance. The audio quality was poor, her words distorted by transmission interference, but the core message was clear. She believed the Empire could be resisted not through superior force, but through simple refusal of its claims to inevitable dominance. Through maintaining spaces where alternative ways of existing could be practiced and preserved. The concept was dangerous enough that I almost deleted it immediately, but instead I added it to my hidden file, recognizing that this was the pattern I'd been trying to understand through all the accumulated fragments. Ahsoka Tano had progressed from youth to wisdom not by accumulating power or knowledge, but by learning to release attachment to institutions and identities that claimed to define her, by discovering that her capacity for meaningful action existed independently of organizational authority or ideological validation. She'd been Ahsoka the Padawan, then Ahsoka the accused, then Ahsoka the exile, and through each transformation, she'd retained something essential, while releasing what was no longer necessary, becoming progressively more herself by becoming progressively less defined by external categories. The imperial structure I served was designed to prevent exactly this kind of development, to ensure that identity and authority remained permanently fused, so that opposing the Empire meant opposing your own sense of self. Stormtroopers were stripped of names and given designations. Officers were promoted through systems that rewarded loyalty over competence. Citizens were bombarded with propaganda that equated imperial authority with natural order and civilization itself. The entire apparatus was constructed to make resistance seem not just difficult, but psychologically impossible, to create beings whose capacity for choice had been so thoroughly colonized by imperial ideology that they experienced servitude as freedom and domination as protection. But Ahsoka Tano proved the system had vulnerabilities, that beings exposed to the most intensive institutional conditioning could still develop the capacity for genuine independence if they encountered sufficient trauma to crack their programming. Her betrayal by the Jedi Order had been that crack, the wound that had allowed her to see through the institutional logic she'd been trained to accept as natural. She'd learned that the Order's wisdom was fallible, that legitimate authority could make catastrophic mistakes, that beings who claimed to serve the greater good could be corrupted by their own power and certainty. And rather than destroying her, that knowledge had liberated her to discover agency that existed beyond institutional frameworks, to become dangerous to the Empire precisely because she couldn't be predicted or controlled through normal means. I started noticing evidence of her influence in places the intelligence reports hadn't documented, patterns in rebel operations that suggested coordination and intelligence, sharing beyond what our analysts expected from scattered resistance cells. Supply convoys that were ambushed had apparently been selected based on knowledge of Imperial logistics that only someone with military staff experience would possess. Recruiting efforts targeting specific Imperial personnel suggested intelligence about who might be susceptible to defection based on psychological profiles that would require access to ISA-B databases. Even the timing of rebel operations seemed designed to exploit Imperial bureaucratic processes, attacks occurring during shift changes or transition periods when response coordination was weakest. She was teaching the rebels how to think like the Empire while remaining functionally outside Imperial consciousness, creating a resistance network that operated in our blind spots because it was designed by someone who understood exactly where those blind spots existed. The efficiency disturbed our command structure enough that resource allocation toward counter-insurgency operations was quietly increased, though the official explanations cited general rebel activity rather than acknowledging a single coordinator whose existence would suggest our intelligence failures were more systematic than we'd admitted. I watched the orders flow through my station, seeing patterns that indicated growing concern at levels far above my clearance. Watching as whole star destroyers were reassigned to sectors where Tano had been spotted, noticing that Lord Vader himself was spending increasing time investigating leads related to her activities. The obsession wasn't just tactical. Something about her survival and continued effectiveness seemed to represent personal affront to the Imperial command structure, as though her existence contradicted foundational claims about the Empire's inevitable dominance and the impossibility of meaningful resistance. Then the executor received orders to proceed to the Luthal sector, vague instructions about investigating rebel activity and Imperial defections that required Lord Vader's personal attention. I processed the intelligence traffic related to the operation and recognized Tano's influence immediately. The rebels there were conducting coordinated actions that suggested professional military training. Their intelligence about Imperial operations was far too accurate to be derived from local sources, and intercepts of their communications included references to someone called Fulcrum who provided strategic guidance. The operation was clearly designed to draw her out, to create a situation where she'd have to either abandon the rebels she'd cultivated or expose herself to direct confrontation with Vader and the full Imperial military resources we could bring to bear. I wanted to warn her somehow, to communicate across the distance and force connection that had developed through my investigation, that this was a trap, that she was being maneuvered into a confrontation that would end either in her death or her capture. But I had no means of contact, and any attempt to establish communication would be detected by ISB monitoring systems, resulting in my immediate arrest for treason. So I could only watch as the operation unfolded, processing intelligence reports that tracked her movements through the Luthal system, reading accounts of her desperate attempts to evacuate rebels before our forces could converge, witnessing through sanitized reports the moment when she finally confronted Lord Vader directly in what the analysts assumed would be her final engagement. The confrontation occurred at some rebel base whose location was redacted from reports at my clearance level, but the outcome was described with enough detail that I could reconstruct the essential events. She'd fought Vader to protect retreating rebels, buying time for their escape by engaging him in single combat despite knowing she probably couldn't win. The engagement had lasted longer than tactical models predicted, her defense apparently augmented by knowledge of Skywalker's technique that allowed her to counter moves before he completed them. But eventually his superior power and mechanical augmentation had overwhelmed her defenses, and according to the official intelligence, she'd been killed when the rebel base's power systems exploded, her body presumably destroyed in the conflagration, though no remains were recovered. The report should have ended there. Another rebel eliminated and another threat neutralized, but something about the account felt constructed rather than observed, as though the intelligence had been shaped to support a conclusion that command preferred regardless of actual events. The analyst who'd compiled it noted that Lord Vader had departed the engagement site immediately without verifying the kill, which was unusual for someone typically meticulous about confirming target elimination. No visual confirmation of Tano's death was included in the report, the explosion cited as preventing recovery or identification of remains. And buried in the technical details was a reference to unusual chronometric readings during the engagement, time distortions that suggested force manipulation at scales that exceeded normal combat applications. I began experiencing the dreams again after that report, more intense than before. Ahsoka Tano appearing in my quarters, with what looked like an awl perched on her shoulder, the creature's eyes seeming to follow me, even when I moved. She spoke about time and choice and the difference between ending and transformation, explaining in words that dissolved from memory as soon as I woke that death itself was something different than the Empire understood, that beings who were sufficiently connected to the Force could exist in states that transcended conventional categories of alive and dead. The dreams had a quality that suggested they weren't coming from my own consciousness, but were being projected from somewhere else, as though she was using our sympathetic connection to communicate across whatever distance or condition now separated us. I started investigating ancient Force traditions in the archives, using my intelligence clearance to access materials related to Jedi philosophy and pre-Republic Force sects, looking for references to survival beyond death or techniques for preserving consciousness independently of biological existence. The materials were fragmentary and often contradictory, degraded by time and deliberate imperial censorship that had purged anything too detailed about Force capabilities that might be weaponized against us. But patterns emerged from the fragments, references to Jedi masters who'd learned to maintain conscious existence after death, to beings who existed in what the texts called the world between worlds, where time operated according to different principles, to Force techniques that allowed consciousness to transcend individual identity and merge with the cosmic force while retaining essential self-awareness. The concept seemed impossible until I remembered the chronometric distortions mentioned in the engagement report, the time anomalies that the analyst had noted but not explained. If Ahsoka Tano had accessed something like the world between worlds, if she'd learned techniques that allowed her to exist outside normal temporal progression, then her apparent death might be something else entirely, not destruction but transition, not ending but transformation into a state where she could influence events without being vulnerable to imperial power in the conventional sense. The possibility was disturbing enough that I should have reported it through official channels, should have allowed specialists in Force phenomena to investigate, rather than continuing my unauthorized research. But by that point I'd crossed too many lines to retreat safely, had accumulated enough evidence of my investigation that reporting it would merely draw official attention to everything I'd discovered, and probably result in both my erasure and the burial of intelligence that seemed increasingly important. The final piece arrived in a transmission from an unknown source, encrypted with protocols I recognized as Republic intelligence codes that shouldn't have still been functional years after the Empire's formation. The message was brief, coordinates and a time, nothing else, but the encryption signature indicated it had been routed through systems connected to my investigation in ways that suggested Tano herself might have sent it, reaching through whatever network of allies and resources she'd maintained despite her apparent death. I knew accessing the coordinates would mean abandoning my post, deserting the Empire, becoming a fugitive who'd be hunted with the same efficiency we'd directed toward her. But I also knew that everything I'd learned through my investigation had led to this moment, that understanding her progression from youth to wisdom required following the path to its conclusion, regardless of consequences. I falsified my shift reports to show routine operations, prepared cover stories that would delay discovery of my absence for approximately 18 hours, and took a shuttle from the executor's hangar bay using forged authorization codes I'd assembled from intelligence fragments over the previous months. The coordinates led to a moon in the outer rim, some abandoned settlement where the only structure still standing was what looked like an old Jedi temple, its architecture distinctive enough that I recognized the style from archived references, despite never having seen this particular installation. The place felt simultaneously ancient and preserved, as though time operated differently here, as though the structure existed partially outside normal causality in ways that made my chronometer display irregular readings. She was waiting inside, though whether the being I encountered was actually Ahsoka Tano or something that had been Ahsoka Tano or something wearing Ahsoka Tano's form remained unclear throughout our conversation. Her appearance was exactly as I'd seen in recent intelligence reports and in my dreams, but there was a quality to her presence that suggested she existed in multiple times simultaneously, that I was perceiving only a fragment of something larger that extended beyond my capacity for normal observation. She knew who I was, knew about my investigation, knew apparently everything I'd discovered and compiled in my hidden files. She explained, though explaining implies linear communication, and what I experienced was more like direct transmission of understanding, that she'd become aware of my attention through the Force. That sustained focus on a force, sensitive individual could create connections that allowed reciprocal awareness. That she'd been watching my investigation through our sympathetic bond, and had decided I was ready to understand what she'd learned through her own progression. What followed was teaching that I can't adequately describe because it existed outside linguistic structures I'd been trained to use. Communication that occurred directly between consciousness, rather than through symbolic mediation. She showed me her memories, not in sequence but in constellation, patterns of experience that illustrated principles about power and identity, and the relationship between individual agency and collective structures. I witnessed her trial by the Jedi Council through her subjective experience, felt the betrayal and confusion and dawning recognition that institutions she'd trusted were fallible. Watched her walk away from the Order, despite knowing it meant abandoning the only identity she'd ever known. I experienced her survival during Order 66 through the absence that had saved her, the guilt of living when her entire community was being systematically destroyed, the process of reconstructing purpose from the ruins of everything she'd believed about herself and her role in the galaxy. She explained that wisdom wasn't accumulation but release, wasn't achieving mastery of some body of knowledge, but rather learning to recognize what knowledge was unnecessary or harmful, developing the capacity to distinguish between understanding that enabled choice and conditioning that constrained it. The Jedi had taught her to seek control over the Force, and through the Force control over circumstances, but she'd learned that control was itself a form of attachment, that trying to shape reality according to your intentions was ultimately no different than being shaped by others' intentions. True agency existed in the space between domination and submission, in the capacity to act without trying to control outcomes, to influence events without claiming authority over them, to exist in relationship with power structures without being defined by them. The Empire represented the ultimate expression of the control-seeking mindset she'd transcended, the logical conclusion of the Republic's trajectory toward centralization and standardization that had begun long before Palpatine revealed himself as a Sith Lord. Every imperial policy was designed to reduce complexity and variation, to create predictability through enforced uniformity, to eliminate the conditions that made genuine choice possible by ensuring that all alternatives to imperial authorities seemed either impossible or catastrophic. We served this system by processing intelligence and implementing orders, becoming instruments of a power structure that claimed to serve stability while actually serving only its own perpetuation. We'd been conditioned to experience this servitude as duty, to feel pride in our efficiency, to believe that opposition to the Empire represented either ignorance or evil, rather than recognizing it as a legitimate response to genuine oppression. She offered not recruitment to the rebellion, but something different. The teaching that would allow me to develop the same capacity for genuine independence that her progression had achieved, to exist in relationship with power structures, including the Empire, without being defined or controlled by them. The process would require abandoning the identity I'd constructed around being an Imperial officer, releasing attachment to the security and purpose that role had provided, accepting the terror of existing without institutional validation or collective identity. Most beings who attempted this transition failed, she explained, because the psychological weight of unstructured existence was more than they could bear, because they'd been shaped so thoroughly by their conditioning that removing it left nothing coherent underneath. But she thought I might succeed because my investigation had already begun the process, had created enough distance from my imperial identity that I could potentially survive its complete dissolution. I chose to attempt the transition because the alternative, returning to the executor and continuing my service as though nothing had happened, seemed suddenly impossible now that I'd glimpsed what existence outside institutional definition might resemble. She provided coordinates for a network of what she called way stations, places scattered across the outer rim where beings who'd chosen similar paths could find temporary shelter and support, communities organized around principles that contradicted imperial ideology by demonstrating that cooperation and mutual aid could exist without hierarchy or centralized authority. The locations weren't rebellion bases, and the beings there weren't rebels in the conventional sense, just people who'd learned to exist in the spaces between power structures, who'd developed the capacity to preserve their agency despite the Empire's claims to inevitable dominance. I've been moving through this network for what my subjective experience suggests is approximately 7 months, though the chronometers indicate only 4. Time apparently operating at different rates when you're not locked into imperial scheduling systems, when your consciousness isn't structured around shift rotations and operational deadlines. I'm learning what Ahsoka Tano learned through her progression from youth to wisdom, that identity is more fluid than institutions claim. That purpose can exist without organizational validation. That power over yourself is more significant than power over circumstances. The process is terrifying because it requires existing in sustained uncertainty. Releasing the psychological security that comes from knowing your role and function, accepting that you might never achieve the clarity and certainty that imperial ideology promises in exchange for complete submission. I still experience dreams where she appears, though now I understand these aren't dreams, but actual force communication. Her consciousness reaching through the sympathetic connection we established to provide teaching and guidance as I attempt the transition she's already completed. She shows me memories of other beings who followed similar paths. Former Jedi who survived Order 66 and chose neither hiding nor vengeance, but something else. Clones who'd retained enough individuality to resist Order 66 programming. Imperial officers who'd recognized the Empire's fundamental corruption and chosen desertion despite knowing they'd be hunted forever. Each story illustrates different aspects of the same principle, that institutional power depends on manufactured consent, that beings possess the capacity for choice, even when systems claim to have eliminated it, that resistance exists in the simple act of maintaining consciousness that hasn't been fully colonized by dominant ideology. The network I'm traveling through is more extensive than I'd imagined. Thousands of beings scattered across the outer rim who've chosen similar paths, who exist in the Empire's blind spots because they've learned to become invisible to the monitoring systems designed to detect conventional resistance. They don't organize formal opposition or accumulate weapons or plan military strikes against Imperial installations, don't do anything that would register as threat to our intelligence analysis. Instead, they simply exist differently, maintaining communities organized around principles that contradict Imperial ideology, demonstrating through their survival that alternatives to Imperial authority are possible, even if they're not powerful enough to challenge that authority directly. Their resistance is existential rather than tactical, proving through their continued existence that the Empire's claims to inevitability and natural order are propaganda rather than truth. I'm writing this on a world whose name I don't know, in a settlement that doesn't appear in any Imperial registry I can access through the network connections I've maintained, among beings whose identities and purposes remain partially mysterious even after months of coexistence. I don't know if this document will reach anyone else, or if it will be intercepted by Imperial intelligence and used to track my location and the locations of everyone I've encountered since deserting. But Ahsoka Tano taught me that outcomes are less important than actions, that agency exists in choosing rather than in controlling consequences, that wisdom emerges not from certainty, but from sustained willingness to exist in uncertainty while remaining committed to principles you've discovered through direct experience rather than institutional conditioning. Her progression from youth to wisdom demonstrates that transformation is possible even for beings shaped from childhood by institutions designed to prevent individual development. That consciousness possesses capacities for adaptation and transcendence that exceed systems' ability to permanently constrain them. She was Ahsoka the Padawan, shaped by Jedi training that should have defined her identity completely. She became Ahsoka the accused, learning through betrayal that institutions are fallible and that legitimate authority can make catastrophic mistakes. She transformed into Ahsoka the exile, discovering that identity could exist independently of organizational validation. And ultimately she became something without adequate designation, a consciousness that had learned to exist in relationship with power structures without being defined by them. Someone who influenced events without claiming authority over them, who taught without establishing schools, who resisted without organizing armies. I'm attempting to follow that progression, though I'm still early in the process, still releasing attachments to Imperial identity that defined me for years, still learning to exist without the psychological security that institutional belonging provided. The fear is constant. Fear that I'll be discovered and captured, fear that I'll fail to develop the capabilities this transition requires, fear that I'll discover there's nothing coherent underneath my conditioning and that removing it will leave only emptiness. But fear itself is data, information about what I'm still attached to, indicators of where my consciousness remains colonized by Imperial ideology, despite my intellectual rejection of it. Each moment of terror is an opportunity to release further attachment, to discover whether I can exist in sustained uncertainty without collapsing back into the safety of structure and authority. The remarkable thing about Ahsoka Tano's progression isn't that she became powerful, though she did, force abilities refined through decades of practice and combat, but that she became free in ways that exceed normal definitions of freedom. She's not free from consequences or circumstances, not liberated from material constraints or immune to suffering, but she's free from the psychological structures that make most beings controllable, free from the belief that authority requires institutional validation, free from the assumption that identity must be defined by collective categories rather than direct experience. This freedom makes her dangerous to the Empire, not because she commands armies or possesses superweapons, but because she demonstrates that genuine independence is possible, that beings can transcend their conditioning if they're willing to endure the terror of discovering what exists beyond it. I don't know if I'll survive long enough to complete this progression. Don't know if the Empire will eventually locate me through the trails I've inevitably left, or if I'll simply fail to develop the capabilities this existence requires and collapse back into the need for structure and certainty. But I understand now why ISB analysts were afraid of acknowledging her existence, why reports about her were buried and redacted rather than processed through normal intelligence channels. She represents everything the Empire claims is impossible: sustained resistance without formal organization, effective opposition without military superiority, freedom achieved through release rather than domination, wisdom developed through experience rather than transmitted through institutional authority. Her existence contradicts fundamental imperial assumptions about power and identity, and the relationship between individuals and collective structures, demonstrates that the system's claims to natural order and inevitable dominance are constructed rather than essential. And if those claims are constructed, they can be deconstructed. If beings can learn to exist outside the psychological frameworks that make them controllable, the Empire's power diminishes proportionally. The military apparatus remains overwhelming. The institutional machinery continues functioning with brutal efficiency, but the system's foundation, manufactured consent disguised as natural order, becomes progressively less stable as more beings recognize they possess the capacity for genuine choice. This is the real rebellion that Ahsoka Tano coordinates, not military campaigns, but consciousness itself, teaching through her example that transformation is possible, that progression from youth to wisdom requires releasing attachment to institutional identity, rather than accumulating power or knowledge. I'm watching the settlement's twin suns descend toward the horizon as I write this, their light creating patterns that remind me of Tatooine, though I've never been there, and I'm experiencing what might be force, connection, or might be simply the recognition that I've chosen a path that leads away from certainty toward sustained uncertainty. Ahsoka Tano taught me this was wisdom, this capacity to exist without knowing outcomes, to choose based on principles discovered through direct experience, rather than rules transmitted through authority structures. The future is opaque, and I can't predict whether I'll be alive tomorrow or captured or transformed into something I can't currently imagine. But the present moment contains choice, and that choice remains mine regardless of consequences, and learning to exist fully in this present, without demanding guarantees about the future, is perhaps the most remarkable progression that consciousness can achieve. She's watching somehow. I can feel her attention through the Force connection we've established, and though she's not present physically, I understand that she's teaching still, that her progression continues and mine can continue too, if I remain committed to the process regardless of outcomes. This is what she learned through her transformation from Padawan to wisdom, that progression itself is the purpose, that becoming is more significant than arriving, that the remarkable thing about consciousness is not what it achieves, but its capacity for sustained transformation despite all the forces that work to fix it permanently in place.